What's up everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Rosendo and we are back with another track breakdown. Today we are taking a look at Release, the next track in my discography. Real quick before we do that, I know it's been a while since the last video. I mentioned last time I had a few video ideas I wanted to do that were a little bit more informative and educational, but I didn't really like how they were coming out, so I kind of had to scrap them, and that took some time away from my upload schedule. And then actually I recorded Release breakdown a while ago, and I realized I wasn't recording the audio, so I wasn't recording the DAW audio, so the FL Studio audio, and I didn't really have any way to kind of get it back, so that put a dent in things. But now I'm back, I'm here. We are taking a look at Release. We're breaking down Release. Next up in my discography is Call. I'll probably end up breaking down my discography fully before I end up getting into those informative videos I was talking about. So it's going to be Release and Call next, and then I'm going to take my time to put those together, those other videos together. Again, I want them to be a little bit more informative and a little bit more kind of for the general population. So I'm going to want to put a little bit more effort into them, not necessarily make a script per se, but just kind of have a little bit more organized, approach to making those videos instead of just turning on my camera and my microphone and talking. In case you don't know, that's actually what I do for these track breakdown videos. I open up the project file, I turn on my camera, and I begin. And that's how I go about recording those. But again, for the informative videos, I'm going to want to have a little bit more structure to them. So they're pretty much more appropriate for the general population. But until then, we're taking a look at Release, another track breakdown video. Hopefully this one's not too long, but there's a lot I want to say about this track. It's a really meaningful track. So without further ado, let's get into FL Studio. All right, so we are back into FL Studio, taking a look at the Release project file. A few things I want to note about the project file right off the bat. Let's take a look at how long it took me to make this track. 15 hours and 18 minutes. Pretty standard. I actually think this is a little bit faster. It's going to be on the faster side for my tracks. If you saw Exposition, I would think Exposition ended at 45 hours. Express, I want to say 25. I can't quite remember Progress. I want to say around 20 or so. But this is going to be one of my faster tracks. And I like it. I think it came out well, not only because it's a little bit simpler than something like Exposition is, but also because I'm just a better producer. It's not necessarily that I know my way around the DAW a little bit more, although that's technically true, but I just made the right decisions quicker. My mixing foundation was a lot better, so I was able to kind of go through the track just a little bit quicker. Plus, from the layering perspective that I mentioned in Release, when you have pretty defined layers, the chords, the bass, and the melody, in this case vocal chops, which we'll get into, it's just easier to mix instead of having a bunch of supersaws all over the place, which I did in Exposition, which took me forever. And even Express kind of had the lead melody kind of blended with the supersaw, which took me a while. But that's enough about that. So we're in FL Studio. Again, 15-hour track, started on September of 23. This was my summer 2024 release. Perfect for the kind of summer feeling I was looking for. And we're looking at about 47 mixer tracks, so pretty normal, about 40 to 50. Again, I'm approaching 50 nowadays. And just real quick up here, you see that this is a copy of the original file. This is still the original file. It's just a duplicate because if you saw the Progress breakdown video, you realize, or at least I realized, and you all also realized that I pretty much want to do everything I do on a duplicate file instead of doing it all on the original file, because then I lose track of where the original file is. Quick update, I actually still had the original file of Progress, but it was labeled something else, and I think I did something weird to it. But this is a duplicate of the original project file, but the same exact thing, just so I can, in case I mess around with anything, so I can record audio without changing what the original project file looked like. So naturally, before we break down this track, we're going to talk about why I made this track, because that's just what I do. And again, there's a lot I want to mention about that. Now, normally I talk about why I made the track and why I named the track what I named it, but I think in this case, it actually makes sense to go in the reverse order and talk about why I named it Release first, and that will lead in a little bit better into why I made this track. And to kind of start off there, what I want to begin with is actually my producer name, and my producer name is Rosendo. And actually, in case you don't know, that's actually my name. My name is Rosendo, in case that wasn't clear. But that's kind of a weird producer name, at least in my eyes. And the way I want to explain it is, back in maybe a few years ago when I was starting off this journey as a music producer and I wanted to come up with a producer name and I didn't know what I wanted my name to be, I was experimenting with a few names. I didn't know if I wanted to be, a made-up name or, a thing or a phrase or an idea. And I kind of didn't really know what path to take. So I was experimenting with a few different things and just trying to get an idea of what I wanted my producer name to be. Rosendo was never really an option. I mean, I always knew that I could go with that, but it was never something I was seriously considering. And I was just considering a few options. Now, that being said, I was having a little bit of a hard time, so I decided to kind of just tackle the root of the idea per se and think, well, why do I like electronic music? What is so great about electronic music? How does electronic music make me feel? And then go from there to see if I can come up with a producer name. And after a lot of brainstorming and a lot of thinking, I ultimately ended up with the word release. And that wasn't something that I was considering using as my producer name, but it was kind of a moment of revelation as to why I liked electronic music so much, because the feeling it invokes in me is the feeling of release. And to kind of elaborate on that a little bit, when I listen to my favorite artists, such as, I mean, I mentioned before, Porter Robinson, Seven Lions, Illenium, Son Holo, all those artists. When I listen to those artists, I really like to kind of get immersed in the music and really allow it to take me somewhere else, take me to another world, transport me somewhere else. I mean, especially if you're listening to someone like 2014 Porter Robinson, even sometimes Illenium, it really just kind of takes you somewhere else and allows you to forget about the world you're living in that moment and be taken somewhere else to a universe where you're listening to that song. And release kind of comes from two places, because not only is it just the raw feeling of release you get when listening to electronic music, where you have this buildup that builds up tension and maybe takes away elements or adds more elements to a moment of release, and that drop where you get everything right in your face and everything just kind of comes at you at once. So there's a raw feeling of release already in electronic music when it comes to that buildup and the drop. But moreover, as I was saying earlier, when it comes to those artists that inspire me, that are really emotional and melodic, release almost existed in another way, where it became this thing where you're listening to these tracks and these songs, and you're just forgetting about where you are in the moment. And as I mentioned, you're being taken somewhere else, which kind of allows you to just forget about everything and really just only listen to this track. It's almost like you're being taken to a universe or to a world where nothing else exists but this track, and you can forget about everything that's going on in the moment, anything weighing you down, anything that worries you, and you're just letting all of that go for 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes or however long the track is. In my case, I really like long tracks that are 5 and 6 minutes long. But that's really the moment that you're experiencing, where you're letting everything go. So again, it's not only the raw feeling of release that you get from the build up and the drop, and where everything just kind of hits you and it feels like everything that's pent up is being let go, but it's also the feeling that you get when you're being transported somewhere else, when you're listening to these tracks and being so immersed in them that you're forgetting about everything else and you're pretty much coexisting with the music that you're listening to. So that's how I came up with the name and kind of the general, not only term, but the idea of release in electronic music. And that's something I wanted to embody, which is why I made this track, right? And I made this track pretty much with the inspiration of those artists that I mentioned, Porter Robinson and Illenium, especially this style. And my goal here was just to capture that in a track and capture my favorite sounds and favorite feelings in a track, in this case, a summer track that has these kind of heavenly, angelic, and melodic features that really take you somewhere else and transport you and have you immersed in the track. That's why this track is actually so meaningful to me, because when I started producing, my goal was always to make emotional and melodic music that would take you somewhere else, just like the music that inspired me. And I have so much fun making things like, what have I made up to this point? Drum and bass, a little bit of progressive house. I'm working on all sorts of genres right now. But my ultimate goal was to make emotional and melodic music, and that's why this track means so much to me, because like Exposition was more of a definition of my sound, and it kind of accomplished the same thing, but it wasn't really quite kind of a solid, kind of meant to serve that purpose in a way of fulfilling that emotional and release feeling I was going for, as Release does, which is why I named it that. But that's why I like this track so much, because in my eyes, and making a track like this, then such an angelic and melodic track that really immerses you with all these big supersaws and angelic feelings, it pretty much puts me in the same realm as those artists that inspired me so much, that I'm trying to accomplish the same thing as those artists that inspired me so much by making these emotional and melodic tracks that really have you immersed in the track and basking in the supersaws and really enjoying everything that it is, which is why I like this track so much. In my eyes, having this track now puts me on the kind of the same playing field as those artists. Now, of course, I'm nowhere as successful as those artists, at least not yet, but having this track puts me in that realm of an emotional and melodic producer that transports you somewhere and really puts a lot of effort and intention into these tracks that are just trying to invoke a feeling at the end of the day, and having you experience what it means to build up that feeling and being taken somewhere else and letting everything go for, in this case, about 4 minutes. So that's why this track is so meaningful to me. All right, so enough about that. Let's actually get into the breakdown, because when we start with this track, the first thing we are hit with is a bass. And I actually really like this bass. It has that rolling characteristic that I really like out of my basses. And there's two things you're going to notice right off the bat. Number one, the bass is being paired with a pedal tone. That's this atmosphere you have right here, which already does a really good job of setting the mood, setting the environment, setting the atmosphere of kind of this heavenly feeling that we're really trying to capture. And again, this is my summer release, and all of my releases were kind of 2024 were kind of almost built around a season per se. I mean, Exposition was released in the winter, and that's definitely more of a winter track. Express is a tough one because it made sense for the winter. It had that emotional kind of feeling to it and that expression to it. I think it could have been released in another season, but I think it made sense. Progress was meant to be released in the spring because it had a little bit more going to it. It had a little bit more energy just when the kind of the weather's picking back up. And Release is just the perfect track for the summer. You know, windows down, big Supersaws, everything just feels kind of nice and almost happy in a way. But it really has that kind of summer feeling to it, which is why I released it in the summer intentionally. But where I was going with that is that's why this atmosphere works so well with the bass, because right off the bat you hit play and that bass is already there, the atmosphere is already there, and you're already being taken somewhere where you feel something's kind of an emotion is already there. And while that's going on, after that we establish the rhythm. Now there's two things I want to say right when this kick comes in. So number one, we're at 90 BPM here. I don't think I've released a track at 90 BPM yet, so I really like the fact that this is at 90 BPM, which is pretty much the BPM that started it all for me. I mean, 128 is awesome and all, but when it comes to these emotional tracks, you know, the Porter Robinson and Millennium, I think 90 BPM is really just the kind of the main one there. Of course, I really like 140 as well when you're talking about, you know, Seven Lions and the melodic dubstep artists, especially Ophelia Records. But 90 BPM, that's just kind of the emotional BPM to me. It's the slow and, you know, get that feeling of release, you know, of whatever it is you're trying to go for. So two things. Number one, 90 BPM. We're at a 90 BPM track now, first one in my discography. And number two, let's take a look at this bass line a little bit closer, because we are actually on a 1-5 chord progression. Now, I like 1-5 chord progressions, and I need to interrupt myself because I'm going to say two things. Number one, my goal for these videos is kind of to reach other music producers, or at least people who really like music and appreciate music. So I'm going to be throwing a lot of music terms. I mean, I've already been doing that, throwing things like EQ and compression and saturation, a bunch of other things. But I'm not going to refrain from using musical terms because that's how I'm going to describe my tracks. So if you can't quite follow along, I'm sorry, but at the same time, it's a way for you guys to learn. If you're not so musically inclined, you guys can learn, you know, the different aspects of music production, and not only music production, but music theory. Anyways, that aside, this is my first 1-5 track. Now, I really like 1-5 tracks, and I like this because the way I look at kind of my discography and music production is you're kind of collecting tracks and creating tracks that all have their own unique characteristics, right? So, I mean, I've made a tech house track. I've made a bass house. We called it bass house track. Then I made a drum and bass track. And then you kind of look at what you're doing. Okay, I made a drum and bass track at 172 BPM. And then I made, you know, a 140 BPM, you know, melodic dubstep track. Then you have Progress at 128, and then you have Release at 90, and they all have their own characteristics. I now have a 1-5 track that's under my tool belt. It's almost like you know, achievements that you're making when you make these tracks, that you're kind of, creating all these things with unique characteristics. So 1-5 tracks. I've made a 1-5-6-4 track, but I actually haven't released a 1-5-6-4 track. So it's all these things, you know, tracks that have kicking. We'll get to this, but it's just about. It's really nice to kind of see all these things that you're doing. But that's beside the point. I'm getting carried away because this is a 1-5 track. Now we do some cool things with the 1-5 in a second, but that's pretty much what we're working with here. So 1-5 on the chord progression. In this case, I believe we're in D. Yes, we are in D. So D-A, D-A is our chord progression for the entire track. Anyways, as we move forward, the kick comes in, and actually you get a little bit of sidechain already on the atmosphere. So take a close listen. And you already hear that the sidechain comes in a little bit. And we get a little bit more groove going once that kick comes in. The one thing I really like about this intro is it just very, very slowly builds up, and you more or less kind of know where it's going, but each time you get more and more of an idea. Because when you start, that bass is just already taking up all that room with that atmosphere in the back, and you're just in the atmosphere for a second. Then the kick comes in, and then you get that rhythm. You really feel the 90 BPM starting to hit, especially with that side chain, and more or less you're really just moving forward the entire time right when the snare comes in. A little bit of an ARP, that kind of filtered synth comes in, and now you're really being transported somewhere. And you just know what's going up because, again, the snare is being filtered, this ARP is being filtered. It really comes in there, and we're building up to this moment where you're really taking into an angelic, an angelic place, an angelic universe, an angelic atmosphere, where the synths really hit you, the bass really hits you, and we get some vocal chops right here. Now, this is very important, so we're going to talk about this. All right, so vocal chops. Why is it so important that I have vocal chops here? For two reasons. Number one, vocal chops to me almost are like a rite of passage for music producers, because at least in my eyes, when music producers are first starting out, they don't really have vocalists to work with, at least I don't. And it kind of just makes sense that the first thing you do after making tracks with no vocals is you start experimenting with vocal chops just to kind of have that vocal there, and you just have some fun with them. So if you listen to a lot of producers, early discographies, some of their first tracks will have no vocals and maybe some vocal chops. It might also just be a thing of an era where, the 2014 era was just really big on vocal chops. But it's almost like a rite of passage where you're going from a producer that has zero vocals on any of their tracks to now including vocal chops, and it just feels so nice to, again, be following the same footsteps as some of the artists that inspired me. And moreover to that, there's actually the second reason this is so important is because this is actually the first track I made using Splice. Now, for those of you who are not music producers, real quick, Splice is probably the most popular sample library out there, subscription-based, where you have access to all sorts of things, drums, vocals, basically any sample, any effect you're looking for will be on Splice. And Splice is, again, probably the most popular library for producers. And up to this point, none of my tracks use Splice. Maybe at the end of Progress, I had a drum sampler or two in there. But before that, I didn't even own Splice. So this is my first track having Splice and using it as it's intended to be, which is, using some samples in your tracks. And one of the reasons I always knew about Splice, I knew it existed, but one of the reasons I put off using Splice for so long is because as a producer, we kind of have a tendency to always need something new and something better to get us through our tracks, and it doesn't really allow us to develop the skills that we need in that moment. And this is particularly new for new producers. Once you're an experienced producer, you can do whatever you want and you already know what you're doing. But when you're new, it's always about having that new preset, that new plugin, that new sample, that new something to kind of really kick up your skills. And that's why I held off on Splice. I wanted to make sure I really honed in my skills and got creative. And actually, Exposition is probably the perfect example of that, because at that time I knew Splice existed, but I was making such a long track, and I really wanted to make sure I was able to make one by just using the skills I already had and getting better at them, instead of always just reaching for a new sample and thinking, hey, I need something to put in this spot. Let me just go grab a sample real quick. So there's a lot of really interesting things I do in Exposition where I play around with filters, play around with automations, and do some cool stuff, play around with sidechain. So that instead of just reaching for a sample and just having it, calling it a day, I have to get creative, and I have to really experiment with my skills and the tools I already have to get better. And then I did the same thing in Express, Progress, and then Release is the first track that I started with Splice. And actually, it's important to mention that I mentioned in Low that I find it really hard to start tracks unless I have something to start with, some melody, some chord progression. This is actually what I started with for Release. So when I was on Splice and I was looking for vocal chops I already had the idea of Release in mind. So I was looking for 90 BPM vocal chops that would fit, the vibe that I was going for. And this is what I started with the track with. So the track had originally nothing in it other than this vocal chop that I found on Splice. Yeah, not much processing on it. So this is pretty much what you're listening to is pretty much what you have. But again, this is what I started with. And when I heard this vocal chop, the track already kind of formed itself in my head, where they get the supersaws and then the progression kind of started coming together. But this is really where the foundation of the track, everything was built around this vocal chop. So let's continue, because where were we? We were right here, where, let's go back a little bit, where the kick comes in, we establish the rhythm, and then the filtered saws come in with the snare to really allow us to establish the atmosphere and let us know we're moving forward. Plus this ARP we have right here that is filtered, and it's just a simple quarter note going down. And the synth seems like it's still on the same spot. But in any case, then the ARP kicks in, goes to the 1/16th. And I really like this part because I mean, I love ARPs and melodic tracks. It's so reminiscent of, you know, something like Porter Robinson. But I really like that change where we go into this pattern where we're going to, we know we're getting somewhere. That 1/16th ARP comes in, the snare comes in, and we're going straight into that build-up into something you know is going to feel angelic and emotional, which are these Supersaws with the vocal chop. And let's take a close look at this. So take a look at this. This is one of the things I really like about this track because, yes, we are dealing with a 1/5 chord progression, but that doesn't mean we need to keep the chord progression per se, at least the rhythm, the same the entire time. This is one of the things I really like about this track. And one of the, I mentioned before, one of the things I really like is arranging and patterning things out. So take a listen to the progression of the bass, because right here we are at 4 beats, 1 bar per bass line. We're going up, down, D, G, D, E, D, G, every bar. And once we get to this part, we're actually at 2 bars per note. So the rhythm of the chord progression changes quite a bit, and that's one of the things that, in my opinion, really keeps the track interesting, because instead of just having the same bass line, at least the same rhythm of the chords the entire time, where it's here 4 beats, 4 beats, 4 beats, 4 beats, we have it, and we go a little bit slower in this part. And it actually works really well with these vocal chops, because the vocal chops last, they last 2 bars, 8 beats. So the having just works really well, and again, it just throws in just enough variance to make sure the 1/5 doesn't get stale the entire track. But again, with these dragged out notes, we really get that kind of that mood that we're looking for, which is more emotional, and that feeling of release where you're being transported somewhere else, especially with these drawn out Supersaws that take up so much room and really let you listen to them and appreciate them and let them soak in. The having of the rhythm really just does a wonderful job there. Anyways, moving on to the buildup. First things first, a few effects here, a few other layers here. We actually have a really interesting pattern here with some vocal chops, or with some vocal samples that I really like to use. So that also does a good job of establishing the mood of the track. And then it changes over here to go into, again, a little bit faster. Just takes up a lot of space in the track, especially in that buildup, which I really like. Plus the kickstart is here, so a little bit more rhythm to them. Has that breathing, that kickstart that I love to use. I mean, in case it's not clear, I love kickstart, which is sidechain. And if you don't know what sidechain is, you're listening to it. It's that ducking at the start of every note. That is sidechain at its finest. All right, so we get into that buildup over here. And we get the snare. We filter out some of the synths. The vocal chop is still there. Again, some effects over here, but mostly just noise, plus this these vocals that are taking up a lot of space. Snare really comes in, being filtered up. Filter some of the chords and the vocal chops as well into the drop. And everything is there. So again, I really like this drop for that exact reason. It just does exactly what I'm trying to accomplish, getting you that emotional, that feeling of release where you're just being taken somewhere else. I love Supersaws. So they just do a really good job here, especially with that bass that is kind of all up in the track. And 3 layers of Supersaws. Why don't we take a listen to them? We have layer number 1. It's actually, yeah, 3 layers. It actually looks like 4 layers. Must have missed one. Oh, this is a bus. Oh, that's why. Usually these are at the end, so that's... I might... it doesn't matter. I'm not going to move it around because this is meant to be the original project file. Yeah, usually this bus is at the end. That's why I got confused. So let's take a listen to these layers. Why not? So we have the main layer. Oh, what is this? This is great. Spire. It's funny because nowadays I'm going to Serum a lot more. I'm pretty sure on Spire you can favorite presets. This is a good one. I just need to find it somehow. All right, that's awesome. All right, layer number 1. EQ, a little bit of compression, which I didn't know how to use, so no clue what this is doing on there. More EQ, some reverb, no clue what this is doing. This is automation, actually. And some imaging, which make it a little bit more mono. I'm okay with that. Higher layer. Again, more EQ, maybe a little bit too harsh. OTT. And then we have this layer right here. Well, this is a really nice one. Even higher really adds that nice highs and that sharpness to it. Also coming out of, actually, where are we here? Also coming out of Spire. My favorite, this one too. That's some really nice. I should go back to Spire. It's actually funny because Spire is the first synth that I bought, and I used to do everything with it. And then I got Serum, and I started doing everything with Serum. And then every time I go back to Spire, I find some presets that I really like, and it reminds me to go back to it more. So I'm really glad I found these because I had Serum when I made this track, so I'm really glad I found those layers. So that's awesome. All right, in any case, really get these Supersaws, and actually there's one more kind of lead layer over here that I was experimenting with. That is right here, just to take up a little bit of this center space. Pretty standard saw. But one of the nice things that I like about this track is just variation in snares, something that I don't mess around with too much. I want to mess around with more, so I really like this variation, especially with these sustained chords. I love sustained chords so much, so the longer you can listen to a chord, the better, at least in my opinion, at least especially for this track. So the variation in snares just do a really good job that at the end of that sustain, you just get a little bit of variety going straight into the next one. A little bit of sidechain here, some variation. Really nice automation right there to switch things up with some more snares to change the rhythm quite a bit. Straight into the next part. Now, here's the other thing about the next part is we're actually looking at a different melody for the vocal chops using Slicex, if I can find it. Here we go. So, a little bit about this. Now, the interesting thing about this is that I had been wanting to experiment with vocal chops for a bit, but I never kind of knew the proper way to make vocal chops. I always knew there was a way to do it in FL Studio, but I never looked into it because I almost never had a reason to. And I found these vocal chops on Splice, and I started using them. But the interesting thing is, one day I was kind of browsing through YouTube, and I saw a video of Ludwig making a track with Porter Robinson, and I watched the whole thing through. Or I don't know if I watched the whole thing through, but I was watching the video, and in the video, Porter Robinson is kind of walking through Ludwig on how to make a track, and he opened up Slicex, or at least Porter Robinson told Ludwig to open up Slicex to make a vocal chop. And I think it was around the time I was making this track. It was either when I was making this track or a little bit before I was making this track. And when he opened up Slicex to make the vocal chops, that was kind of the aha moment for me, where I learned how to make vocal chops on FL Studio, because again, I'd always wanted to, but I never really got around to learning how. And when he did that in that video and I finally learned how to do it, it was awesome, because then I knew how to make vocal chops. And one of the things I did is I actually then started just to experiment with the vocal chops I already had. So I took the vocal chops and put them in here. And one of the things Slicex does is the way it works is it basically just divides the vocal sample, or any sample, into different parts, to the point where they're assigned a key. And what you do from that point is you just press the note and it plays that little snippet of the sample. So basically you have the whole thing just mapped to different notes, and you can make it your own pattern with it. And it was interesting because when I took the vocal sample and put it into Slicex, then I kind of came up with this pattern right here that I really like. And that's where I went on the second half of the drop. I decided to switch up the melody a little bit. By the way, from now on, we're going to call these vocal samples the melody, because at the end of the day, they're the melody of the track. So I switched up the melody a little bit and made this melody over here that plays really nicely into the second half of the drop, with the snare, with a variation in the synths. And now we are in the second half of the drop with this new melody made out of the same vocal sample. Now, the other interesting thing about the second part of the drop, if you'll notice, is we talked about that variation in rhythm with the chords. So take a look at this. Over here, we are at 1 bar per chord. 1 bar per chord. Here we go to 2 bars per chord. When we go to the build up and the drop, we are back at 1 bar. We stay at 2 bars per chord. And then that second half of the drop, we just pick up the pacing a little bit more to go back to the 2 bars per chord. To the 1 bar per chord. And it works really well with the vocal chops because these vocal chops are pretty much in 1 bar before the second half comes in, and then it repeats. So that variation in rhythm is just so nice, and it's one of my favorite parts about this track because it's so simple, but it shows that just these small decisions can make such a big impact on a track, especially in a track where you have 2 chords the entire track, a 1/5 track, which there are so many 1/5 tracks out there. So this variation in rhythm just does a really good job of keeping things fresh. So let's take a listen because we have the rhythm halved again. We throw in a hi-hat in there, and we throw in some really nice snares to have a whole new feeling to it. So nice crash right there with this new melody. Cut the snare over here, and we stay moving forward. We get a few new things here, but some really nice movement over here that I'm going to break down in a second. So a few things to note. Number 1, a really good transition where we cut the snare, cut that last kick into the second verse. Again, we call these verses for a lack of a better word. But the rhythm is halved again. We're taking the melodies away. We're sticking with the Supersaws. At least looks like actually all the Supersaws are gone. Yes, so we're not sticking with the Supersaws, and I remember why. So we're not sticking with the Supersaws. Supersaws are gone. But we get this standard rhythm where the rhythm is halved. So we're back at 2 bars per chord, which is interesting because it slows things down in such a way where the bass line actually becomes the main character here. And this was actually my intention for the second verse, and actually somewhat the intro because I really like this bass line. But the goal for the second verse is just to have the bass line be the center of attention. And that's the thing that's going to be taking up the most space. So you have these drums. You have this kind of impact right here with what appears to be, should be over here with this vocal chord. It's actually should be the same vocal sample over here. Just pitched up. I want to say it is, but I'm not going to double check. So we have this vocal chord that gives you that attack. Then it fades away. We have a new supersaw that takes up a little bit of room, but not too much. Just adding a little bit of noise there. And yeah, I was going to say, and we have an atmosphere over here as well. Should also be the same atmosphere from the beginning. So things are mostly just taking up room here, plus the impact, the attack on the vocal cord. But the main character here, the main focus is meant to be on the bass line. Really nice rolling bass line right there, taking up all that room. And the interesting thing about this is one of those areas where I had to kind of force myself to become a better producer, because at the beginning, actually not necessarily at the beginning, but near the end of this track, these little fills weren't even there. What other fills do we have? Something like this. These fills weren't there. So really all you had was just that bass line kind of then playing the entire time, going straight into the other attack of this chord. And I liked it. I liked that the bass line was the main player, but it's still felt like I needed to add something more. So with these fills, the interesting thing that happens is it almost turns into a type of call and response that is something that I really never experimented with. Now, some producers swear by call and response, and some producers are really good at call and response. I'm more of the kind of sustained note type person. I love sustained chords and just really letting a chord hit you for the entire duration, just like you saw kind of over here. So I love sustained notes. I love the kind of the emotion they invoke. So I was never really one to not only experiment, but I was never really good at any type of call and response. Now, to be clear, this is kind of like a pseudo call and response. But this is really nice because this kind of, all these fills over here on the second half of this bar, actually on the second bar, I should say, all these fills on the second bar were something that weren't really natural to me, and it was never something I really did. So this part of the track really forced me to become a better producer because, as I mentioned, you get this vocal chord that kind of serves as the attack because it's there at the beginning and then it fades away until it hits again over here. So when this part comes in, you get that impact of the vocal cords, and you get all these fills almost as a response to the vocal cords. Just for them to hit again, you let that bass line really hit you for a second, then you get that response. And each time it's different responses, which again, we're calling them responses, which again, I was never really the best at. I'm the best at sustained notes and just really having that feeling there. So I wasn't really good at taking one sample and placing it only at one part of the track. I work best with notes. So this is just a really nice part where I had to evolve as a producer and get creative. First one is that drum fill that I really like. Then we get these hi-hats, pretty simple, plus a little bit of a vocal effect right here into some melodies right here, and then more snares. A little bit quieter with increasing velocity. And then we go into kind of the second half of the second verse and pay attention to what we're about to get into one more time, because we get the snares that come in. And a few things happen. Most important, that velocity gets halved again. Sorry, the rhythm gets halved again. So we're back at 1 bar per note, which I really like. We also get a few things. We get this hi-hat over here, these hi-hats, this loop. We get the sidechain actually gets taken away on the bass, which I actually really like. Again, I experiment with sidechain quite a bit, but you get this rolling pattern on the bass line, and then it gets taken away. So you're really listening to everything, but the groove is kind of made up for with the hats. And the nice thing is that the bass is a little bit kind of still there instead of getting drowned out by all the rhythm. With the sidechain being taken away, the bass kind of remains a powerful part of the track. You get another attack that I really like, that are kind of here going side to side. It adds a little bit more oomph to it. And you get all these new arps in here that just take up more space, bounce around, play around with another melody stacked on top of it that I also really like, that we're going to isolate right here on top of the vocal cord. So a lot of really nice kind of layers to this part. Let's throw on this again. Let's throw on the attack. Let's throw on the wider, this is muted. Let's throw on the bass. Throwing on the hats. With a kick. And you really get this nice moment in the track where everything is there. And after all that, and the snares hit, you get taken to the point where everything gets stripped. I mean, this is awesome. Now, I mentioned in actually the exposition breakdown that you guys saw that not everything happens intentionally. Sometimes things happen on accident and they're left there intentionally. This is one of the interesting things about this this part of the track, because I struggled a little bit with the second verse. I didn't really know where to go or what to do, especially with this part, because I didn't really just want to extend the rhythm a little bit more. I wanted to change it up in a way that I didn't really know how. And what ended up happening actually is originally it sounded something like this. And let's just extend the hats because. So this is originally all I had. And what I ended up happening is I accidentally deleted the bass line. I don't remember what I was doing, but at some point I deleted the bass line from here. So I'm listening to the track thinking about what to do. And when I hear the bass line get taken away, and I didn't realize why, because I did it on accident, I really liked how it sounded. So this bass line actually got taken away on accident, and I kept it that way, but it had such a great feeling to the track, because we go from the drop to the second verse where you get this kind of call and response, but the bass is really just playing the entire time, and that's the main character. And you transition really nicely into this part with all the groove, all these hats, the arps, the melodies, only to transition to a part where it gets stripped and the bass line goes away, and now that kick and snare are really just there. I really like this part of the track. Once I did that, I actually kind of heard the ARP come back in, and the ARP does a really nice job of kind of establishing the feeling of that part, because it really builds up into the build-up. It takes you kind of a level higher and higher. We have a non-chord tone over here that kind of gives it just the right amount of oomph, with some risers, with some vocals, some reverse vocals into the build-up again. And now the rhythm is back to where it was at 2 bars per beat. We get the synth coming back in for the build-up. The melody is back. The second melody is back, building up into the drop. And now it's really hitting you because we have the kick and the snare on top of each other. The hats are back. We have the original vocal sample. And everything is all here. We have the attack as well. Some more noise. I mean, I really like this drop. And not only do I really like the drop, I really like the arrangement of the track. Because everything is just so intentional with the changing of the rhythm of going from over here, the 2 bars per note on the build-up, back to 1 bar per note on the drop. And it just works so well, and then especially with the snare, it's stacked on top of the kick. It just adds a whole feeling of emotion and a whole feeling of release to the track. This kind of really strong feeling of release where the saws are in your face, everything is built up over here. You get the noise building up, the synth building up with that side chain that should be getting turned on progressively, if I remember correctly. But it looks like I'm misremembering here. It's actually the bass that I'm thinking of, right? So the bass over here, the chords aren't even there on the first half of the build-up. Then the Supersaw comes in, but it's actually the bass that the side chain is off over here, and then it gets turned on right there. At least on the second part of on the second layer, which is this respace that I almost forgot to mention. We actually had a respace on the second build-up that I really like. I love respaces. It adds the right amount of the right amount of mood to the track that you're going for. Let's actually mute just the respace. Sorry, solo the respace, because it adds just the right amount of feel to the bass line. Then the sidechain gets turned on, and the build-up in its entirety is all up in your face. So that raw moment of release where everything kicks in. Again, bass line is halved, and we actually go back to the original vocal chop we had. Now, I'm going to give you guys some free arrangement workshop, because this is just, it seems so simple, but it makes such a big difference in the track. I mean, let's call this one Melody A because it's the original melody we established. And let's call this Melody B right here because it's the second vocal chop melody we established. I mean, it's so simple, but it's so, I mean, in my eyes, so perfect, where on verse 1, we had this vocal sample on the build-up, and on the drop, we had Melody A on the build-up, and on the drop, we introduced Melody B. On the second verse, we have Melody B on the build-up, and on the drop, we introduce Melody A. So everything just works so well. And if I'm guessing correctly here, we actually have on the first drop, we're starting at 2 bars per note, and on the second drop, we're going straight into 1 bar per note. So it's just these small changes that just make the biggest difference. And actually, the Melody B stays aligned with the 2 bars, with the 1 bar per note, so it kind of works out that way. But just going from these changes where you have 2 melodies, and you can't really do much with this because this is a vocal sample. I can't really alter this that much per se, although I can make a whole new melody out of it with some more vocal chops. And just that small change of going Melody A build up, Melody B drop, to the second half, Melody B build up, Melody A drop. I mean, those changes just make all the difference when it comes to making sure your track stays A, interesting, B, doesn't get stale, and C, keeps progressing forward and evolving into something new every single time. Especially when we establish the Melody B on the build-up, or something we've already heard, and we return to the original Melody A on the drop. I mean, it just works so well. On top of that, you actually have these this vocal arp over here that we broke down earlier on top of everything. So it just does such a good job of stacking the vocals and the harmonies on top of each other. Throwing these on there. Then the basses, the Reese stays there. We got the sub. We have the rolling bass still there. Hi-hats are there now. And everything is stacked. Drum fills, and everything is really there up until the end, where you get this riser to close it all off into the outro. And again, the rhythm gets halved because the bass line is at the center of attention again. And that's actually the only thing you get here, right? These noises kind of transition you out, but then it's just that rhythm you get from the bass line and the kick and the snare. So again, that bass line really being the main character, we dragged it out back to 2 bars per note to really let you feel it. And that's your outro. Until you drop the drums. Drums get dropped, kick stars gets dropped, and you actually come back to this vocal chord that you got over here earlier, right? This is the one you got right when the first kind of moment hits you, where the vocals were initially introduced, the melody A, and it comes back. And the really nice thing about this is that the chords are just distinct enough where you get kind of these strange intervals on these notes, so that it adds kind of a nuanced feel to the outro. And you get this filtered vocal sample just to really let it kind of hit you one more time. It adds just the right amount of mood at the end of the day as well. It's really just about the feeling it contributes where it's filtered. While the bass line is there, the bass line actually starts fading away as well. And I also really like this outro because instead of just letting the bass line play and end, I took the same note and just sustained it. So it almost feels like it's transitioning from that rolling 1/8 bass line into the sustained note. So the outro is really nice there, really lets it drag out and close nicely. And that is Release. Now again, I didn't really mention too much about the mixing. At the end of the day, it's kind of all the same, just EQs and what is this? Okay, yeah, most of this is just automation. It's just sidechain and things that are filtered up and down. So even though it looks like a lot, it's all EQs and compressors I didn't know how to use. This isn't even a compressor. This is saturation. Distortion, I should say. But again, not much going on there. It really is just about the feel and actually just the smart layers here where you're using really nice things like atmospheres, vocals, really nice vocal chops over here, and just some noises and effects all over the place to establish the feeling. And the Supersaws and the bass are really what do the job there. Actually, I mean, I can't even lie. Everything does a good job there. The drums I really like. Great drum right here. This is also one of my favorite snares that I use quite a bit, and I'm starting to use a little bit more. Really nice bass line that I actually got from another track. I had another track idea that uses this bass line, and when I heard this vocal sample and I started making the track, I wanted to use that same bass line. So I took it from another track. You get this nice atmosphere right here. Supersaws. I mean, a little bit of everything. But again, I'm not going to break everything down. You already heard it all. I really like this ARP too. Might favorite this as well. And of course, it's from Spire. I need to keep going back to Spire again. That's the main takeaway of the video. All right, and that is about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this track. Again, perfect for the summer. This is hopefully going to be uploaded in November, so summer's over. But maybe next summer you guys can play it. Right now I have tentative another summer track planned for next summer as well. But again, I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me guys know what you think. If you think it kind of compares, to those melodic Porter Robinson and Millennium style tracks. Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments about the track, about the arrangement or anything that you liked or disliked about it. I know I talked a lot about arrangement and establishing a mood, so those are pretty much the big ones in this track that I hope you guys walk away with. Again, looking to hopefully reach music producers with these videos to give you guys some inspiration, give you guys on the, some inside look to some of my tracks, and maybe help you guys out in your own tracks and thinking about things a little bit differently, especially if I think about things differently than you do. We can all help each other out here. So again, thank you guys for watching. Next time we are breaking down Call, so look forward to that, and I'll see you guys next time.